So let's hop in and talk a little bit about trauma. So I'm going to define trauma and then talk a little bit about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. These are both issues. So the definition of trauma and then the ACEs study are kind of foundations of trauma. And important to kind of review and revisit, just so everybody knows what we're talking about. I feel like the ACEs study in particular is something that a lot of folks refer to, but sometimes people don't actually know anything about. And I do think that there's some key components in that that are really critical to kind of selling trauma responsive schools, and why it's so critical. So first, starting off with trauma, I like this SAMHSA definition. It's easy to remember. So kind of these three E's. So when we talk about trauma, what we're talking about is something that's resulting from an event, a series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in these different areas. So it's an event that's experienced and then has these effects. And so there's a lot of conversation right now about what is trauma, what is not trauma. Is it trauma with a little t or trauma with a big T, or, oh, that's bad trauma, or this is not as bad trauma. So hopefully from this definition, we can see that when we go down those roads of what is trauma and what is not trauma, we've kind of missed the point. The reality is big trauma, little trauma, it probably doesn't matter in the end, because what we're talking about is how an individual experiences an event that then leads to these different effects. And so the pushback I often get from schools or friends in community settings is, how do I know if this behavior is related to trauma or not? How do I know? And then my response is, does it matter? And then what that gives us is an opportunity to say, how will your behavior or your response change if you know that it's connected, or if you think it's connected to trauma, which furthers the conversation. So I'm not saying that trauma doesn't matter. I'm just saying that we want to think about why we're going into this. Why trauma? Is it trauma or not trauma? The reality is that if we are looking at a person's behavior, a young person, a grown person, and we're seeing effects, we're seeing big behaviors that don't make a lot of sense, that don't seem like they're connected to the context around them, there's a good chance that something else is going on, right? Behavior comes from somewhere. And so if we try to do the things that we typically do to support the kinds of behaviors that we want to see, and it's not working, then there's a good chance that probably there is some effect there, when we're starting to kind of think about trauma. So event, experience, effect. This is also why trauma is so tricky, is because often when we're trying to make sense of trauma, we look at a behavior and we're trying to understand it. Maybe we learn that there is an event, and then we say, well, that's not that bad. Why is this effect coming from this event, right? And so that's that tricky individual experience part. Every individual experiences these things differently. And we can't, it's not useful for us to try to position ourselves in a place to judge that. Well, that's too big of a reaction. That's too small of a reaction. It's a reaction. And so let's learn from it. Let's learn from what we're observing, and kind of go from there. It's one of the things that I love about trauma responsive schools, and really even a trauma responsive framework, that I think it just helps us expand our toolbox, so that we have different tools and strategies that we can use. Okay, so I want to talk for a minute quickly about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So if you have attended anything or had conversations about trauma before, chances are that this ACEs has come up in one way or another. So I want to unpack this briefly, and especially to talk about why this was so important, or kind of transformational at the time. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this was a study that was conducted from 2015 to 2017. Kaiser Permanente Insurance Agency out in California did this giant study. And it was in response to some healthcare professionals who were actually doing weight management interventions. And what they found is that when they were doing these weight management interventions, that when they did them, here's the intervention. What they're finding is that about half the time they worked really well, and half the time they didn't. And so they saw this pattern in terms of this, this response that this was having for their patients, and they're trying to figure out why. Why is it working for some people and it's not working for others? And as they started to look further and try to understand more, what they came to realize is that they thought that maybe the intervention or the effectiveness of the intervention was related somehow to other characteristics of people's lives, and that maybe it had something to do with things that they had experienced. And so they had this question, let's learn more. And so they were able, because of, they're an insurance company, to do this incredible study that really changed the way that we look at and think about trauma. And so what they did is they had current data for a giant set of humans. So this is the kind of research, when we're talking about it, that not only was the initial research done, that was built on other research. Since then, this stuff has been replicated a gazillion times with all kinds of populations. So when we talk about, is this research we can really kind of believe in? The answer here is yes. It's been done a lot. And so with this original study, they had all these folks and they had them kind of indicate current functioning. So, did they have a job? How were their relationships? How's their health? Those different pieces, and they continued to track that. But they also had these friends fill out the ACEs survey, which surveyed these folks on these 10 different experiences, and they identified which one of these things that they experienced. And that's what you're seeing here in these circles on the screen is, different types of abuse, 2 different types of neglect, and these 5 different types of household dysfunction. And so this is when they were young, did they live in a household where an adult demonstrated or was experiencing this kind of household dysfunction? And so they put that all together and did some research, and minds blown. They learned things that shifted the way that we think about and talk about trauma. I can say with confidence that one reason we're here today talking about trauma responsive schools is because of the ACEs study, and because that's how big some of these ahas were. So Melissa, you might ask, what was so interesting about what they found? So the first thing is that when they did this research, they found that ACEs were far more prevalent than what they had initially thought. And part of the reason that the ACEs study was kind of such an aha moment, or a series of aha moments, is that prior to this point, a lot of people were looking at these experiences. They were looking at trauma, they were trying to understand it, but they were often doing it in silos. So you would have the folks who would be doing research on child abuse and neglect. You had the folks who were doing research on what it was like to grow up as a child in a family where they witnessed domestic violence. All these kind of different sort of silos. But this was one of the first times that they really brought it together, and in a big way, we're looking to see how prevalent these experiences were. And what they found is that 2/3 of the population, and that, again, this has been replicated over time, 2/3 of the population has reported at least one type of adverse childhood experience. And they found that 16% had experienced 4 or more. And so they were surprised about how common and how prevalent these childhood experiences were, adverse childhood experiences. Going on, they also found that that these ACEs, when people had these adverse childhood experiences, they were linked to every kind of possible outcome that you could imagine. So health outcomes, behavioral outcomes, kind of these life potential outcomes. So academics, can I get a job? Can I keep my job? Do I, go to work when I have a job? All of those things happened kind of in the way that you would predict that if you have these adverse childhood experiences, you're more likely to experience these adverse outcomes. And then they also found that it had an additive effect, which means that if you had 1, then you were a little bit more likely to have these outcomes. And if you had 2, there was more, and 3 and 4 and 5, so on and so forth. And all of this seems really logical, and kind of a little bit of like, how is this gonna, so life altering for these folks at the time? But it really was that they were putting it all together, and they were able to then, and we were able to have a different kind of conversation about trauma. One of the other really important things that happened when they were looking across these different types of adverse childhood experiences is that they started to see that what mattered most was actually this dosage effect. So what mattered most was if you had 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these adverse childhood experiences, rather than the actual nature of the adverse childhood experience itself. So before this, there was some kind of thought, there was a school of thought that some of these traumas were worse than others. So if you had, say, childhood physical abuse and a parent who went to prison that was this bad, as if you could quantify it, and that it would lead to these kinds of outcomes. Um, and if you had this, that it wasn't as bad and it would lead to this kind of outcome. And so ACEs really kind of put it all together and kind of mixed it up and showed actually these are all adverse childhood experiences and they all can lead to these negative outcomes. And that's really this dosage effect that is most important to look at. 4 is not as good as 1, right? 0 is better. And so we were able to kind of reframe that conversation. This is also kind of going back to where we started with that trauma definition, that trauma is trauma is trauma is trauma. So when we're talking about this worse, better kind of issue, ACEs really kind of leveled the playing field with that. And so then we started talking about adverse childhood experiences, period, which was really a different way and a real shift in kind of how we talk through that.